Hey folks, this is Riker with a comparison video on the Diablo 3 Necromancer versus the Diablo 2 Necromancer. The Necromancer pack released yesterday and I've been streaming a lot, my voice is a little hoarse, and I'm probably streaming right now as this video is being released. I do plan on having a full review video on the Necromancer pack, but I also wanted to make a video specifically for Diablo 2 players who are wondering how the Diablo 3 Necromancer compares to the original. Do the old skills feel the same? Does the D3 Necro fail to live up to the D2 Necro? Were there any important skills that the team missed? Well, let's go skill by skill and compare. So the Diablo 2 Necromancer had the skill Raise Skeleton, which allowed you to raise one skeleton from an enemy corpse. As you leveled your skill, you can grow your skeleton army. In the early Diablo 2 days, every skill point that you invested would allow you to raise one additional skeleton, eventually letting you have an army of over 20 really weak skeletons. But necromancers with huge skeleton armies were lagging out the servers. We called them Lagomancers, and they were actually used to crash servers in order to produce duping exploits. So eventually the skill was changed to cap out at 8 skeletons, with each skeleton being a lot more powerful than they used to be. Diablo 3 has the skill Command Skeletons, a skill that lets you raise an army of 7 skeletons. While it is one fewer skeleton, in Diablo 3 you don't need to actively raise the skeletons. They just spawn one after the other, with no corpses required until you have a max of 7, and if any die, they'll just respawn. Additionally, you have an active power that lets you command the skeleton. You point at a target, you hit the button, and your skeletons rush over and attack that specific target. And depending on the rune you apply, you'll gain some form of buff in that attack. So the winner here is the Diablo 3 Command Skeletons. One additional skeleton does not make up for the ability to actively control your pets and direct them to a specific target, plus not needing to rely on corpses to respawn your skeletons when they die. Although, the real winner here that captures the fantasy of having this huge skeleton army is the original Diablo 2 skill. So we're going to continue along with our minion skills and move on to the golems. Diablo 2 had Clay Golem, Blood Golem, Iron Golem, and Fire Golem. Diablo 3 has one golem skill with 5 different runes. There is no Fire Golem, there is no Clay Golem, there is no Iron Golem. The only golem that was retained was the Blood Golem. And the new golems include Flesh Golem, Ice Golem, Bone Golem, and Decay Golem. The Diablo 3 golems feel more fitting of a necromancer. The Bone Golem is cooler and makes more sense than a Clay Golem, which is more rooted in the actual real-world lore of the golem. The Ice Golem makes a little more sense than the Fire Golem, but honestly not by very much. And Diablo 2's Iron Golem is something that's just dropped entirely with no replacement. The Diablo 2 Iron Golem was forged from an actual item, and it would adopt the magic properties, the attributes that the item had. This was a really cool mechanic, and allowed for great customization of your golem, but it also meant destroying an item. The D3 devs opted to not give players that struggle, that debate. But the funny thing is that I believe Diablo 3 and its Lootpocalypse would make it much easier to have an Iron Golem than in D2 when you weren't wading through legendary items. That aside, the D3 golems also all have an active effect. They're not just there and they go do their thing and act like dumb AI. You hit a button and then they go over to the targeted area and they do something like freeze enemies, or they heal you, or they explode into a bunch of corpses that you can then use with your corpse skills. So overall, I'd say that the Diablo 3 golems win here, with the caveat that the Iron Golem could have really been brought over in a cool way. Bit of a shame that we lost that, so that's one little aspect of cool that wasn't brought over. Next, Diablo 2 had Raise Skeletal Mage. Like Raise Skeleton, this lets you raise up to 8 mages. More in the past, but changed for reasons we've explained. Diablo 3 also has Skeletal Mage with several rune options, but it doesn't require a corpse. Instead, it lets you raise a mage for 6 seconds, and you can have a max of 10 active at any time if you're able to maintain that many. There are ways to extend the duration from 6 seconds, but you can never make these mages permanent. This has been a contentious issue for a lot of people. D2 gave you mages that lasted until they died. In D3, the short duration makes mages feel less like pets or minions and more like attack spells in disguise. Particularly the Contamination rune on Skeletal Mage, which basically makes the mage sit in place and deal damage over time, which is basically only visually different from any other skill that would say put the ground on fire and deal damage over time. However, the fact that they despawn means that you have to keep spawning them, which does encourage a more active playstyle, though not necessarily in a good way. The Command Skeletons is an active playstyle in a good way. You act as a player to make them change target. Golem is active in a good way. You act as a player to turn on the Golem's power. Skeletal Mage is active in a bad way. You have to act as a player to spawn them again. You're not deciding what to do with the mages, you're deciding whether you want mages or not. And the answer is always yes, you always want mages. In practical application, in an endgame build, you're going to want to maintain 100% uptime on your mages, so it's just a button that you have to press periodically with no real thought that goes into it. If you don't have a build fully set up, then resource may be an issue, and it does become more of a decision whether you want to have a mage up or not. But then this is at odds with the fantasy of commanding a skeletal army. The cool thing about the mages is having a bunch of them. Not, oh, well, maybe I could afford to spawn a mage now. All that said, the different rune options offer great diversity, so Skeletal Mage is a bit of a mixed bag with respect to how it compares to Diablo 2 Skeletal Mage. The mages are more useful in D3, but you have to keep summoning them constantly, as opposed to only when they die. But at least they don't require corpses. So I give this one to Diablo 3 Skeletal Mage, but only by a slim margin. Then the last of the minion skills we have, Revive. In Diablo 2, a revived minion lasted 3 minutes or until it died, and every skill point invested increased the number of revives you could have, up to a maximum of 25. In Diablo 3, a revived monster only lasts 15 seconds. Again, the duration could be extended by a few seconds, and you can have a total of 10 out active at any time. The rune options aren't terribly interesting, with the most interesting one letting the revives degenerate back into corpses once their duration has ended. This allows you to summon them again and maintain 100% uptime on your revive army. The other difference is that rather than target a specific creature to revive, when you revive all the monsters in an area. This is both good and bad. It's good in that it's more resource effective. You, bam, instantly revive basically 10, you're done. But the downside is a little bit less customization. In Diablo 2, you'd go around and you would methodically pick what you wanted to revive. Diablo 3 is a faster paced game though, so that direction better fits Diablo 3. And overall, I say I prefer having it that way in Diablo 3 specifically, but that's basically the only way in which the D3 revive is better than the Diablo 2 revive. So overall, because D2 revives last longer and you can have more than double the number, D2 revive is the winner here. Moving on to the poison and bone spells. Diablo 2 had Teeth, a spell that shot out spectral fangs. With every skill point you'd shoot out more teeth, but a lot of the teeth would tend to miss. Teeth was an iconic necromancer skill, but it wasn't the most useful one. It was a starter skill. In Diablo 3, Teeth is a rune on Bone Spear that shoots out physical teeth in a wedge-shaped attack pattern, kinda like a shotgun. The D3 version feels more useful, and it honors the spirit of the original skill, but it doesn't quite capture the same feeling as shooting Diablo 2 Teeth, both because of the change from spectral to physical, and because it doesn't shoot out in the same kind of impractical way. I think making Teeth a rune on Bone Spear was the right way to go about implementing Teeth into Diablo 3. It did not deserve its own skill. So I think the devs did do the right thing. Because of that, I guess I have to give the win to Diablo 3 here, but I do gotta admit that I miss the Diablo 2 Teeth. On to Bone Armor. In Diablo 2, it was pretty straightforward. You'd summon Bone Armor, and it would create this swirling bone barrier around you that would absorb damage. As it got damaged, chunks of it would get destroyed, poking holes in your armor, allowing damage to get through, and you'd have to summon it again to keep it up. Diablo 3's Bone Armor is completely different, keeping only the name. You summon it, and it encases you in literal bone armor, which grants you damage reduction. I like the visual, but some people don't and prefer Diablo 2's visual. There is, however, a set that, when you equip it, it makes your bone armor look more like the Diablo 2 bone armor. It turns it into this swirling bone NATO that's even more expansive than Diablo 2's bone armor. Sort of like a mix of the Druid's Hurricane, along with the bone armor from the Necromancer. But the Diablo 2 bone armor as a skill was much more interesting. Damage reduction, while very useful, is ultimately a boring mechanic. compared to having a literal wall of bone flying around you that would intercept projectiles and it would crumble as it takes damage. So winner here, Diablo 2 bone armor. Next Diablo 2 skill we had was Poison Dagger, and there's no real equivalent in Diablo 3. What it would do in D2 is add a poison damage over time effect to a dagger. You can say that instead the Necromancer has Grim Scythe as a melee attack. It's a resource generator, and one of the runes has a poison damage type. So this is kinda similar to Poison Dagger. For the D3 Necro, the dev team decided to avoid damage over time effects. They left that to the Witch Doctor. Again, they were trying to not become redundant with the Witch Doctor. At first, they weren't going to have the Necromancer do any poison damage at all, but because again, the Witch Doctor is all about the poison. But then the devs did opt to go with poison, but they flavored it as blight, so it doesn't feel the same as the Witch Doctor's poison. Now, Poison Dagger in Diablo 2 was a skill that was very strong in the early game, but ultimately became a lot less useful later on unless you specialized in it. And generally you'd go Poison Dagger and Poison Nova. Diablo 3 can't quite recreate this playstyle, though the Poison rune on Grim Scythe is one of the more useful runes, applying a random curse with every hit. So in some way you can argue that the fantasy is retained, but it's just not the same. Now, for most people, the loss of the Poison Necro isn't that big of a deal. But for those who did play Poison Necromancers, they'll likely be unhappy with the Diablo 3 Necromancer being unable to capture that same feeling, even though Poison or Blight skills still do exist. For that reason, I won't declare a winner here because it's very personal. I personally didn't play Poison Necromancers, so I don't really miss having the Poison Dagger. But if for you, Poison was a Necromancer, then you're gonna be disappointed. Next skill, Corpse Explosion. In Diablo 2, you targeted a corpse and it blew up. More skill points increased the radius of the explosion. This skill was really powerful and really fun. In Diablo 3, you target an area and blow up all the corpses in that area. It perfectly captures the feel, and it's even more fun because more corpses are exploding at once. Add in rune options, and D3's Corpse Explosion is the clear winner over Diablo 2's. It's literally just the same old skill, which was amazing. Diablo 2's Corpse Explosion was amazing, but now it's even more fun. The only problem in D3 is that the way endgame balancing works, Corpse Explosion isn't so clearly a powerful option. While you're leveling, it's great, but the way the endgame is structured, the skills that are buffed by the sets and the items, that's kind of going to determine what are the most powerful skills, not just the base skill effect, which is what you get to experience more during the leveling process. Next skill, Bone Wall. In Diablo 2, you can summon a wall of bone to block enemy movement. Enemies could destroy the wall, but it allowed for very interesting control of the battlefield, and you can typically shoot projectiles over or through your bone wall, whereas enemies were blocked. I actually suggested to the D3 devs to include Bone Wall. Overwatch, StarCraft 2, Heroes of the Storm, all these games have characters that can summon walls to control the battlefield in some way. The Witch Doctors can technically summon a zombie wall, but it isn't really something that can exert battlefield control the way the Diablo 2 Necromancer could. Diablo 3 does not have Bone Wall or anything like it. It would certainly be a game-changing power, and maybe that just wouldn't fit Diablo 3's playstyle. But I can't help but wonder how such a game-changing playstyle would feel in Diablo 3. I'm gonna give this one to the Diablo 2 Necro, if only because it added another element of play, another mechanic that the Diablo 3 Necromancer, and no class in Diablo 3 for that matter, has at all. The Diablo 2 Necro had Poison Explosion, which frankly wasn't a great power. It was basically just a worse version of Corpse Explosion. And D3's Corpse Explosion has poison runes, so D3 comes out on top here, trimming the fat and just making Corpse Explosion more interesting. Diablo 2 had Bone Spear, which was one of the Necro's main ranged attacks. It pierced enemies and it was a signature skill. Diablo 3's Bone Spear perfectly captures the feel of Diablo 2's Bone Spear while adding interesting rune options, like dealing more damage per enemy that it passes through. For this reason, Diablo 3's Bone Spear wins. Diablo 2 had Bone Prison, similar to Bone Wall, except it would create a circular shape to either trap enemies or serve as a protective wall that would completely surround the caster. Diablo 3's version of Bone Prison is a passive ability that gives some skills a chance to trap enemies in a bone prison for 3 seconds. This passive feels like it's just paying lip service to Diablo 2's Bone Prison. It's neutered, it's unreliable, it's less useful. It's not that same thing that it creates a wall that can be destroyed. It literally just traps an enemy in place. It's tantamount to a root. So D2's Bone Prison is the clear winner here. I could imagine a skill in Diablo 3, let's call it Bone Wall, where every rune changed the shape of the wall, from your classic line to a circular bone prison to maybe even something like a Waller wall that's a rectangle open on one side. I mean, how good would it feel to finally be able to use those walls against Waller elites, the ones that have been trapping you for so many years? Next skill for D2, we have Poison Nova. This is probably the Necromancer's best poison skill, and it is the most signature poison skill. Everyone remembers those incandescent green sperm cells shooting out in all directions, right? In Diablo 3, we instead have Death Nova. The rune options do include a poison rune, though it's flavored as Blight, but they lack the same visual pizzazz as the Diablo 2 Poison Nova. Other rune options include Blood Nova and Bone Nova, which do look cool, but it's still not the same Poison Nova. Ultimately, I'd call this one a draw between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. Then we have Bone Spirit, which summons a homing projectile in both Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. And D2 is one of the Necromancer's best ranged attacks, alongside Bone Spear. The difference between the two is that in D2, Bone Spirit used mana and could be spammed, while in D3 the skill is on cooldown. You gain a charge every 15 seconds and you can hold up to 3 charges. So you can spam 3 in a row, but then you have to wait 15 seconds before you can cast it again. That said, every time you consume a corpse, you knock a second off that recharge time. So there are benefits and trade-offs to cooldown versus mana. Because it's not using mana, it doesn't compete for resource with Bone Spear, allowing you to cast both without having to decide, okay, do I want to throw a Bone Spear right now or a Bone Spirit? But again, you can't spam it like in D2, which was kind of fun to do. So overall, again, I'd call this one a draw between D2 and D3, but I will note that the D3 Bone Spirit still feels like the D2 Bone Spirit. Alright, on to our curses. So in D2, you had the Amplified Damage Curse, Necromancer's staple, but I always found that it was a boring skill. Useful, for sure, but just the name is boring and technical, and its effect is dull. Diablo 3 instead has a curse called Frailty, which makes a monster just die automatically once it drops below 15% of its total max health. This ultimately does the same thing as Amplified Damage. It makes a monster die faster, but it does so in a way that's much cooler and interesting and more fitting of the Necromancer theme. I'd say that Frailty wins out over Amplified Damage. Diablo 2 then had Iron Maiden, a skill that made enemies reflect damage back onto themselves. Iron Maiden was one of the most well-known Diablo 2 curses, and the Diablo 3 devs chose to not include it. The only thing that's slightly similar is a passive called Aberrant Animator, which gives your pets 200% of your Thorns damage. And in beta, there were efforts made to create a Thorns Necromancer that reflects damage, but ultimately it has to rely on pets. So it's just not the same as the Diablo 2 Iron Maiden, so Diablo 2 wins here. Diablo 2 had a curse called Terror that caused afflicted enemies to run away in fear. Diablo 3 has no such curse, but there are a couple of runes for skills that apply fear effects. I personally don't like fear effects. Having monsters run away from you is just annoying when your goal is to kill monsters as quickly as possible. That said, Diablo 3 doesn't waste an entire skill on this, instead making the fear a secondary effect on skills that are already doing more useful things, so I'd say Diablo 3 is the winner here. Diablo 2 had a skill called Confuse, which would cause monsters to get confused and attack each other. While this was a fun skill, it wasn't super useful in the endgame because monsters didn't do enough damage to each other. Monster health would rise more rapidly than monster damage. Diablo 3 doesn't have the same curse, but there's a rune here and there that can produce somewhat of a similar effect. Bone Spirit, for instance, has a rune that possesses an enemy temporarily, making it attack other monsters, joining your side. Ultimately, though, I'll declare that there's no winner here between Diablo 2 or Diablo 3. Diablo 2 also had the Attract curse, which was basically like Confuse, except attracted monsters didn't attack each other. They only attacked other monsters. It's like it created its own faction of attracted monsters that would attack either other monsters or you, whoever was closest. Again, it's a skill with some limited use. You'd maybe put one skill point into it to cause a distraction when needed, but I doubt anyone is going to miss its absence in Diablo 3. no winner here. Diablo 2 had Life Tap, a curse that lets you regain life by hitting the cursed enemy. Diablo 3 has the Leech Curse, which does the same thing, though it's not as powerful as in Diablo 2. Diablo 2 made you leech 50% of the physical damage you dealt, whereas in Diablo 3 you regain 1% of your health. While the rune options do offer more utility than Diablo 2's, the real reason that Diablo 3's Leech beats out Diablo 2's Life Tap is that in Diablo 3 you can stack curses on an enemy. In D2, only one curse could ever be in effect, so you had to choose. Putting Life Tap meant you're not putting Amplified Damage, for instance, so you're sacrificing attack for recovery. Diablo 3 lets you have both the attack and the recovery by applying 2 different curses, so because of that, Diablo 3 squeaks out a win here. Then Diablo 2 had Decrepify, a curse that makes enemies take more damage, slows them, and lowers their damage. Amplify Damage was the better option if you wanted an enemy to take as much damage as possible, but Decrepify certainly had its place as a powerful Necromancer curse. It was just a more defensive option. In Diablo 3, Decrepify only reduces enemy movement speed and damage. It doesn't also amplify damage. But the runes let Decrepify stun or give you a speed buff or a cooldown buff. But the real reason it doesn't matter that Decrepify doesn't make enemies take more damage is because you can stack curses. Frailty is the curse that makes enemies take more damage, effectively, so we don't need Decrepify to also do that. Diablo 3 only has the 3 curses. Leech is the one that makes you gain life, Frailty is the one that makes enemies die faster, Decrepify is the one that nerfs enemies. Each does its own thing, there's no overlap, and you can have all 3 effects on an enemy. In Diablo 2, you had overlap between curses, some were just basically worse versions of other curses, and it kind of had to be that way because as you leveled up, you progressed along a skill tree, so you would unlock the more powerful version of the curse and this and that. For instance, you had the Weaken curse in Diablo 2, which just lowered a monster's damage, so that basically made Decrepify amplify damage plus Weaken with some slow thrown in. But once you got Decrepify, you would not use Weaken anymore. So we don't miss Weaken in Diablo 3. And the Diablo 3 Decrepify edges out a victory over Diablo 2's by allowing for more utility with stacking curses and their rune effects. Now, Diablo 2 had the Dim Vision curse, which basically blinds enemies to anyone who's not standing right next to them. Diablo 3 has no equivalent here. But there are runes on the curses that do things that sort of have similar outcomes. You can stun an enemy, you can reduce their move speed to 0. Dim Vision had some situational use, but other curses were overall more useful. We'll declare no winner here between D2 and D3. Now that's all the Diablo 2 Necromancer skills. In addition to what we've gone over, Diablo 3 Necromancer also has a number of new skills, some of which are Corpse Lance. It's a powerful skill that rips bones from an enemy corpse and hurls them as lances or spears at an enemy. You have Army of the Dead. It's an insanely powerful skill on a 2-minute cooldown that raises hundreds of skeletons to just surge and kamikaze in an area, dealing a ton of damage. You have Blood Rush, which is a sort of teleport mobility power that basically makes you shed your body, make your blood travel to another area, and then you regenerate your body in that area. These skills are a great addition to the Necromancer's arsenal. They feel right, they give us even more skills to play with. So this here is another win for the Diablo 3 Necro by having even more skills to play with. Now there's one last thing we'll compare here, and we touched upon this a little earlier. Who is the better commander of the undead? I know a lot of people loved having the massive undead armies in Diablo 2. It's not even possible anymore to have that same size of army, even in Diablo 2 if you go back to it today. But you can still have 8 skeletons, 8 skeleton mages, 1 golem, and 25 revives. Though it was difficult to maintain all 25 revives, still we'll assume 25. That makes a total maxed out army of 42 minions. In Diablo 3, you can have 100% uptime on 7 skeletons, 10 skeletal mages, 10 revives, and 1 golem. So 28 total minions. Diablo 2 wins here. You can have the bigger army in Diablo 2. So, as you can see, the Diablo 3 Necromancer is an evolution of the Diablo 2 Necromancer. It's equal to or greater than it in most ways, with a few exceptions. But we gotta remember that the only reason the Diablo 3 Necromancer could be as fun and cool and awesome as it is today is thanks to the Diablo 2 Necromancer, which in my opinion goes down in gaming history as one of the most iconic and cool characters to play. And that wraps up this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think the Diablo 2 Necromancer was better than Diablo 3's? Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rikers Raiders for more Diablo content.